Good morning, everyone. I'm Nina Sachdev. I'm the communications director for MIF. Yesterday I was back there. Today I have the great privilege of guiding this next discussion on abortion. Scary word. No, we're going to be unpacking the abortion narrative. I was a little nervous about how I would introduce this conversation because abortion is just one of those topics. It's extremely personal. But then the other night, before the Eagles game, my 9-year-old daughter asked me, Mommy, who is Dr. Oz and why does he want to ban abortion? And also, what is abortion? And at first I panicked because I was like, oh my God, I've been dodging your questions about how babies are made. How am I going to explain this? And then I thought, I don't need to get into all that. And I just said to her, sweetie, abortion is a medical procedure that women need sometimes. And she was like, okay, well, that doesn't really sound like something that should be banned. And I was like, yeah, I know. If only it were that simple. So while abortion is a topic that may be uncomfortable for some of us in this room, it's also a reality for many. And it's a reality that's rapidly changing, and we need to examine how we change along with it. Since the repeal of Roe versus Wade, which protected a woman's right to have an abortion for nearly 50 years, most abortions are now illegal in 13 states. One of the great things about being a part of Media Impact Funders is that I get to see a lot of what's happening across the landscape of media philanthropy. And over the years, in my own research and observations, it's become very clear to me that abortion is a topic that's ripe for our discussion today, and it requires further clarity and understanding. And what I've seen is that the abortion disinformation machine is working overtime. For one thing, it's not actually as polarizing as the media makes it out to be, because the majority of Americans support abortion protections. What I've also seen and written about in the past and talked to a few of you in the room about is that the counter narrative, the response to the disinformation machine, needs support. So what this is not is a conversation about how any of us feels about abortion. It's a conversation about how funders can address the vulnerability of abortion rights and the fallout of these persistent, harmful, completely false narratives. Because at the end of the day, abortion is healthcare. It's an extremely common part of a woman's reproductive journey. And the nuanced personal stories that journalists tell as we navigate this crazy shifting legal landscape post-Roe is incredibly important. So, joining me in this discussion to understand the relationship between media, abortion, and reproductive health are my two incredible guests, Galina Espinoza, the president and editor-in-chief of Rewire News Group, and Steffi Van Ree, multimedia journalist turned documentary filmmaker and a producer on a new documentary called Battleground, which follows the work of several anti-abortion groups, which we'll get to dig into in a moment. Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
First, just let me say, I'm really excited that we're able to talk about abortion on the main stage at a Journalism Funders Conference. So thank you for being here. All right, let's start unpacking. Galina, let's start with you. So Rewire is a news vertical. It's the only news organization that's exclusively reporting on reproductive health and sexual health and rights and justice. So obviously you've been really busy for a long time. I want to talk about the prevailing myths around abortion because this conversation is so polluted by disinformation. We need to dig into what isn't true so that we can formulate strategies to support what is true.
Absolutely, and it was so great to hear Jelani talking about this need for journalists to revisit some of the foundational concepts that they have when they approach their reporting, because there are a lot of assumptions, particularly around abortion, that are just patently false. And unfortunately, by continuing to perpetuate these myths, we're adding to stigma around abortion, and we're telling a very flawed narrative. So I'll start with one that you referenced when you were up at the podium, this idea that abortion is a polarizing issue, right? This is the thing. We're not going to talk about abortion. It's too divisive. It's contentious. We don't want to get into it. Well, the reality is, in June, Pew Research Center did a survey of American adult feelings about abortion. And what they found was that 61% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal in most or all cases. 61%. That is not a divisive statistic. That is a clear majority. And what's really interesting is that Pew has been doing this survey every couple of years for the last decade or so, and that number has remained fairly consistent. So this is an issue that people have resolved in their minds. This is not an issue that is, proving contentious for most American adults in that country, and yet that's not the story that is being portrayed in most media outlets. And I think it's really important to ask the question, well, then why? Why are we hearing this position that is so clearly and easily disproved? Well, 2 years ago, a research outlet called Global Strategy Group actually did an analysis of abortion coverage. They looked at many of the key mainstream media players, looked at how they were covering abortion. And what they found is that almost 80% of the time, abortion was being covered by a political, legal, or breaking news reporter. Think about that. You're assigning a political reporter to cover abortion, which is a medical procedure. It either happens under the supervision of a medical professional or through medication that is dispensed by a medical profession. So, as a journalist, I would say, it seems pretty clear that a healthcare reporter should be covering that story in much the way that climate change is covered by a science reporter. And yet that's clearly not happening. And even more telling is that in these stories, only 14% of the time was a medical expert quoted, and only 8% of the time was a patient quoted. So again, this is a really skewed, flawed narrative that is emerging out of this prevailing myth that abortion is a polarizing issue. And when you have that kind of coverage, it perpetuates other myths, such as the idea that abortion is a niche issue. This is something that we as a nonprofit hear a lot when we talk to foundations. You cover this niche topic of abortion. Well, right now it's October. It is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. You can't go to any online platform and not be aware that it is Breast Cancer Awareness Month, which is amazing. But the statistics tell us that 1 out of 8 women will have breast cancer in their lifetime. Meanwhile, 1 out of every 4 American women will have an abortion. 1 out of 4. And let's not forget that for every one of those women, there is a man involved. And there are also, the friends and the family members who help this person make this decision and navigate this experience. So the reality is that the majority of Americans will have an abortion experience. And yet that is not at all anything that we see in how this narrative is told. And then the final myth that I want to touch on is this idea of who abortion patients are, because this is another area where old tropes and stereotypes really come into play. I think, if you ask most people, and think about this for yourself, to close your eyes, and what's the first image of an abortion patient that pops into mind? For most people, it's someone young. It's a teenager. It's a young woman. The truth of the matter is that 60% of people who get abortions are parents. Moms get abortions, and they get more abortions than any other demographic group out there. And I think why that is such a compelling statistic that I wanted to share is because these are people who are already parenting, who know what it is like to be a parent, and they are saying, I cannot be a parent to the child or the children I already have if I don't get an abortion. I cannot be financially secure. I cannot have, the kind of life that I want to have with my children, with my family, if I don't get this abortion. And I think when you start to look at those kinds of just, how we've inverted, what the kind of the narrative really is, you see that it's a very different story that needs to be told and that is missing from the conversation.
And we'll talk about coverage more in a minute, but let's get into what's happening in the meantime, which is that disinformation is turning into legislation in state capitals. And
at an alarmingly fast rate.
Right, and we're seeing some really severe restrictions on abortion that aren't rooted in evidence. So what are the most alarming pieces that we need to be concerned about, and how is Rewire approaching that?
Yeah, I think the thing that everyone needs to be paying attention to with these pieces of legislation is just how vague the language is. We're hearing a lot of Republicans who are now kind of running scared because abortion is turning into a voting issue. In fact, I know we have some Kaiser folks here. Kaiser Foundation did a survey last week asking folks, what are the health issues that are most important to you in the upcoming midterm elections? The number one health issue is not prescription drug prices or anything like that, it's abortion. This is what they most want to hear candidates talking about. This is particularly true in progressive cities in red states, places that have, one of the 13 states that has banned abortion. They want to hear candidates talking about it, and it's motivating them to vote. And it's increased their motivation actually even since June when the Supreme Court decision came down. So this is an issue that's really motivating for people. This is an issue, again, that we've talked about, has impact. And what's so concerning about all of these pieces of legislation is that they're saying things like, oh, well, we're not going to ban that kind of abortion. We're going to make sure the mother's life is, if it's in danger, of course you can get an abortion. But we're seeing countless stories of hospitals not knowing how to define that. How do you define, how imminent does a mother's life need to be before she can get a life-saving treatment? That is not something that is easily defined. And there are a lot of patients who are already, facing extremely challenging health scenarios as a result of this. And that's kind of the point. The point is to throw the system into chaos. It's to make everyone afraid of saying the word abortion, of supporting abortion procedures. And I think to us, that's the most concerning thing, is that even folks who want to give abortions are feeling like they cannot because the language is so vague.
And you have a clip.
I do have a clip. So we did a documentary. We were outside the Supreme Court in June when the Dobbs decision came down. And I think one of the things that we really excel at, because we've been in this space as the only ones covering these issues for 10 years, is that we don't just cover the moment, we kind of tee up what's coming next. We're always looking like, okay, so this happened, what is that actually going to mean 6 months from now? And so the day that the Dobbs decision came down, we were outside the court, and the audio you'll hear, it's very emotional. It was a podcast. It was our podcast special reaction pod that we did that day, and that's the voiceover that you're going to hear. But it talks about not only that moment, but also what we're now going to see come next, which is a push for a national abortion ban, as well as the introduction of a fetal personhood bill, basically legislation that would equate a fetus with the person who is carrying the fetus.
Let's see what this looks like.
What we didn't get was the coward's compromise that we were all braced for, right? The gaslighting decision that said, we're going to uphold a Mississippi 15-week ban, but not call it overruling Roe versus Wade. No, what we got was basically a word-for-word verbatim of the Alito leaked memo from last month, explicitly overruling Roe versus Wade, explicitly overruling Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and it's got to tell. Because it doesn't even say we're explicitly overruling these cases to send it back to the states. It says we're explicitly overruling these cases to send the issue back to the electeds in Congress in the states. So for everybody who is out there immediately saying abortion's protected in X, Y, and Z places, it is for right now. But what I want to make very clear at the start of this podcast is even before they got to the nuts and bolts of the analysis, right? In the table of freaking contents, Alito shows the full hand. This isn't sending abortion back to the states. It's the first time in this country's history that an unelected majority of Supreme Court justices have taken away a fundamental constitutional right.
Okay, Steffi, this chaos that Galina was telling us about is actually really organized. And I think you're the best person to tell us about that. You're a producer on Battleground, which I thought was such an eye-opening window into the highly coordinated work of the anti-abortion movement. Tell us about the film.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here on behalf of the Battleground team to have this important discussion and to speak alongside you, Galina. And it's interesting to see this clip because I've spent so many hours in front of that very Supreme Court, right, making this film. The story of Battleground started in the spring of 2019 when Governor Ivey in Alabama signed into law a very, at that time, unconstitutional, complete abortion ban. And it was one of the first ones that really, garnered a lot of national press. And so our team, too, led by director Cynthia Lowen, took note of it and went down to Alabama to film with pro-choice advocates and to see what was going on. And so when she returned, we actually started wondering, where did this law come from, right? Like Galina was mentioning, 61% of Americans do support the access to abortion, and we've even found numbers as high as 7 in 10 Americans support access to abortion. So if that's the case, then why are we having these very intense, no holds barred laws being pushed through? Because after Alabama, a lot of states followed. And so we really wanted to take a look at that, and what we found very quickly was that the anti-abortion movement is, as you said, it's very well organized, it's very young. It's much more led by women than we expected. And so what we did is we decided to follow 3 women at the head of these organizations. And, we came to them and mentioned, this is a fact, right? Your movement is very successful. It's having impact on legislatures all over this country. And that's a fact worth understanding. And could we follow them? And so that's exactly what we did. And of course, we couldn't expect the years that unfolded, especially 2020, was much crazier than we all expected to be, and we were out there in front of the court a lot. And we followed, as they did, what they eventually accomplished, which is overturn Roe. And I think, that's definitely not what we expected when we set out to make this film, but we came to quickly understand it and, felt the need to tell people, this is coming, it's going to happen. And people would say, no, that will never happen. And we would tell them, no, this is what they're doing and how they're doing it and why we think it's important to make this film. And so we're gonna watch a trailer for the movie, and something I do want to mention before we dive into that is that while we chose to center these anti-abortion advocates at the center of our film, we did do so with extreme care, and we were very due diligent in not sharing further misinformation. We let them speak in their own words, but we also are very measured, and there's a lot that didn't make the film. And so of course there's statements that are so outrageous that everyone will understand that it's just not true. They'll talk about oh, we're gonna adopt all the babies right after Roe, don't worry about it, we'll take care of your babies. That stuff is very clear and untrue, but there's so much of it that we just didn't include because we did want to make sure we'd be very careful about what we share and not. So yeah, I think the film very much started as an exploration of what was going on in abortion legislation, but by the end of it, and the film was finished a little bit before Roe was overturned, we really ended up with a film that also goes into this minority group that's really leveraged their power and manipulated it so that they can push their own agenda.
Let's watch the trailer.
The pro-life movement is at our strongest position after almost a half century of turmoil now.
Well, you haven't been paying attention. We've been amassing a network that no one else can rival in the country.
Join me in creating an America where abortion is no longer celebrated, accepted, and legal.
It really is about the tyranny of the minority. The antis have weaponized the rules of the game.
There are a lot of people who want to choose life, including us college students that are female.
Being an atheist, liberal, pro-lifer is a weird life.
We have promiscuous sex and we don't think you should be able to have an abortion.
That map shows our battleground states. We've gone from defense to offense because of a very definite strategy, and that is to elect a pro-life president who will nominate judges to come to the table and start passing laws that save lives.
There is a battleground in the courts, which could be the constitutional end of Roe.
The nation is rocked today by the death of a Supreme Court icon.
The battle lines over the court's future already being drawn.
We just got one massive step closer to seeing abortion abolished in our lifetime. We're so freaking excited!
People have been trying to overturn Roe v. Wade for a long time, but the fact that you're putting our lives at risk to do it, it's un-American.
Texas abortion law is in effect today.
Women can't get abortions after 6 weeks.
And she didn't want to schedule?
By forcing people to have children, you're keeping them in this cycle where they can't get out of poverty, they can't get out of debt. That cycle keeps the people who are on top on top.
I know, what do you say about that, right?
Yeah. Well, I've seen the film, and one of the things that really surprised me that you mentioned was that this movement is led by women, and the narrative that the old white male lawmaker is trying to subjugate us is not the full picture. That's just kind of what we're seeing, and there's so much more happening behind the scenes. They're so resourced, they're extremely strategic, they're reaching women when they're young. But the other thing that I appreciate so much about this film and why we wanted to bring it here is that it is so restrained and it's respectful, and it humanizes the other side. And so what should we take away from this? What do you want us to learn from this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do think a lot of what we want people to take away is all the things you mentioned, right? Because we found that a lot of people, the first thing that they respond to is, oh, I didn't know that, whether that's there's so many women involved, or they're so young, or there's so many more of them than I ever expected. So I think just showing that in itself is very worthwhile, and just reckoning with that, and then to really kind of dive deeper into these strategies so that, whether you are a pro-choice organization or you have another cause, you can use these strategies too. I do think they are very, specifically focusing on young people. For instance, Students for Life is represented in all 50 states and in more than, I want to say, 1,300 campuses. So you could take that list and make sure that in every single campus that they have a club, that they have a presence, that you're there too, And I think, no, please.
And if I can build on that, they're also using the media to ensure that they are reaching young people starting at the age of 13. So in June, Political actually did an analysis after the decision came down, and there was a huge spike in targeted ads on both Google and Facebook to users starting at age 13 for crisis pregnancy centers. I don't know if folks are familiar with what a crisis pregnancy, and I am deliberately using these air quotes. These are essentially centers of misinformation that trick women into believing that they are places they can go to get abortions, and when you go in there, you are basically given all this propaganda about why you shouldn't get an abortion. And these are things that in many states are actually state-funded. Legislators pass bill to ensure that that these centers can exist, and they literally are just temples to misinformation around abortion. And so the movement is very, very effective in using digital tools and digital media outlets to ensure that their messaging is reaching folks as young as 13.
No, absolutely. And I think there's studies too that show that specifically platforms like Facebook is where they do most of their work and where they spread most misinformation, right? Like when it comes to these topics of abortion, that's where they go. And they're always on social media. They're always making sure that they have the first press conference spot. Like when there's these days at the Supreme Court when they might expect a hearing, they're front and center. They'll stay overnight so that they're right in the line of sight for reporters. And reporters are kind of faced with, well, we have to talk to you because you're right there. And people who support abortion access are all the way over there. So you get there first. And they're just kind of relentless in the methods that they'll have, and they just won't stop. Like I'm still on all these mailing lists because of the work that we did with them, right? And I think for every pro-choice organization that emails me, I get about 10, maybe 15 emails from the other side, sometimes from the same organization, multiple times a day. And they'll tell you exactly where you need to go, how to take action. They'll train you to have these conversations online to try to persuade other people to join their organization. So yeah, they really have found a place in social media landscape to do that work.
It really is this tyranny of the minority, and I think that's important to understand. I think it's also really important to understand that they root their cause in religious freedom. And this should be alarming to all of us because this concept of religious freedom is coming to the Supreme Court in a really big way this year. This strategy has been tested, iterated, and perfected when it comes to abortion, but they're now taking that same rallying cry of religious freedom to all sorts of other human rights. They're taking on gay marriage. They're taking on all sorts of cases involving, various acts of discrimination, saying that this violates my religious freedom. And I think, a phrase that we use instead is either religious imposition or religious tyranny. Because they are trying to impose their religious beliefs on how all of American society lives. And I think it's an important distinction. Language really does matter in all journalism spaces, but particularly in this one. And it is encouraging, again, Jelani was talking about all the ways that you can add parentheticals and make clear. And one of the speakers yesterday talked about how now they call out in a parenthetical that this person doesn't accept the 2020 election results. All those ways in which you're signaling to the audience that this is someone who is a spreader of misinformation or who is lying to you. We haven't seen that permeate the abortion coverage in the mainstream media, and yet it is the place that probably most desperately needs it.
Well, and I think too, to not use their language, right? As you mentioned, it's so important. And so you see all over the trailer, they'll say one thing, we'll say anti-abortion movement. I don't think we need to be playing on their playing field because it just puts them at an advantage immediately. If they're saying we're pro-life, then what makes that, of the rest of us? So,
and news organizations are evaluating this in all of their coverage. The Philadelphia Inquirer, in fact, refuses to use the word audit to describe, what Republicans were trying to do when they were contesting the election, because it was not an audit. And they made that decision because they realized that was just adopting the language of Republicans to tell a false narrative. And yet, again, in the abortion space, even failing to put pro-life in quotes is inaccurate. They can call themselves the pro-life movement all they want, but that's the name of their movement. That does not necessarily define what they are doing or who they are. And I think that, this kind of just casual adoption of those kinds of phrases is really, really skewing the narrative.
Okay, well, let's bring this back to philanthropy because there's just so much that we have to address. There are a couple dynamics that I want to talk to you both about. The first is that after the leak of the Dobbs decision in philanthropy, there were a flurry of articles, and they were basically, in the Chronicle of Philanthropy and in other philanthropic spaces, that were basically asking, well, what do we do now? What happens now? And there's one particular article that I found really interesting because it outlines all the things that philanthropy can do to support abortion protections and access to abortion. And they include things like support for legal defense funds and direct service, which are all really critical, and we need those things. But there's nothing about narrative. There's nothing about supporting media, nothing about the urgency to combat the disinformation, and nothing about the need to support a response. There's another dynamic which is related, and it's that reproductive health and abortion and even sexual assault and rape have typically been funded as women's issues, from women and girls' portfolios. And here we are, we're on the other side of Roe, and we're all screaming at the top of our lungs that my body, my choice, and autonomy over one's body, the idea that that's a pillar of democracy, is being challenged. And so the threat to democracy is crystal clear here. What does philanthropy need to do? How does philanthropy need to recalibrate? I know there's a lot to unpack there. We only have 2 minutes, so.
Well, I will say first too that it's not just a women's issue, right? Like as Galina said, like it touches most people in some way or another. But the same people who overturned Roe, the Supreme Court is making decisions about all kinds of cases. Like there's so many cases coming up that, challenge voting rights protections or affirmative action in higher education. So these are the same people who decide on what we can or cannot do with our bodies. It'll go so much further than that. So I think one thing that is really good to keep in mind is that it's all connected, and that we need to be talking about these conversations and telling these stories not in silos, not as, oh, this is only a women's issue, or this only matters now because Roe just got overturned. We really need to be thinking about the long term. Like, we made this film over the course of 3 years, which is pretty fast actually for a documentary. And of course, when it came out, everyone's like, oh, it's so timely, it's so timely. And while we agree, we also do think it's very evergreen in some ways. Like 5, 10, 20 years from now, it'll still tell the story of how Roe got overturned, and it'll still talk about what Alexis McGill Johnson mentions as the tyranny of the minority. And so I think it's important to, where you can, be able to support these types of stories, right? That really look at much more than just this moment, but speak to long-term solutions. Now that our film is done, we're also working on an impact campaign, and we're so lucky to be generously supported by a lot of philanthropists, like foundations like the Sobrato Foundation, the De Novo Initiative, Perspective Fund. And what we do is really use the film as a tool, as kind of a starting point. So we take it into all these states where either there's a ballot initiative coming up, right, for the midterms, like in Kentucky, or we take it to states where abortion is already banned. And we bring in all these local organizations and partners who are already doing the work on the ground, doing grassroots work, working with people, whether that's to expand access or to provide funds or to get them to go out and vote. And we bring them all in because we do think that when people are all in a room together, like we are now, there's so many possibilities, right? There's so much opportunity, whether that's people after their film, they're so fired up, right? And they want to do something and they ask, what can we do? And if we have people like from their communities present who can tell them, like, here's where you need to go and vote, here's where you come volunteer. Like, these might be people that they've never met. They might have never heard of these organizations, so they can find ways to support them in the work that they do. And I think it's also an opportunity for us to be in touch with people that we might not agree with, right? Like, it's much easier to do that through storytelling, by seeing what other people thinking, where they're coming from. You know, the people at the center of this film are obviously anti-abortion, but they also have to watch Samantha in Alabama, who had an abortion and who is really fighting hard to make sure that other people can have one too. And if even one person can be changed by that, or have a new idea, or starts to like think about, oh, maybe there's people in my life who have been through this, I think that's worthwhile. And so supporting these types of projects that not only do the work of reporting it while it's happening, but think about what you can do afterwards, I think is very important.
Wonderful. Final thoughts before Roshni drags us off stage.
So Rewire News Group is, as Nina said, the only media organization dedicated to covering reproductive sexual health rights and justice. That justice piece is really important because the justice piece, that lens, talks about not just if and when to have a child, but how to raise a child. How to raise a child, that how covers climate justice, it covers housing justice, it covers racial justice, it covers economic justice. This is all of the issues central to raising a family in this country. And so our issue set is really, really vital. And yet we are only exclusively funded through gender programs at foundations. We actually do not receive funding from a single journalism foundation, which is obviously an ongoing frustration, particularly in this moment. We have the expertise, we drive impact, and again, getting back to that idea of knowing what's coming next, free speech, fundamental pillar of democracy, free speech is on the chopping block as a result of what the Supreme Court did with Dobbs, because in taking away the constitutional right to abortion, they have made all sorts of abortion restrictions possible in the states. And I will give you one compelling example that should be very frightening to all journalism funders, which is that over the summer, the National Right to Life Committee, which is the largest committee working to advance anti-abortion initiatives, actually drafted model legislation that would target journalists for reporting on abortion. Under that very vague aiding and abetting abortion language that we've heard in some of the state bills that are being introduced, they're now using that to try and encourage legislators to go after journalists for this as well. And we partnered with Mother Jones and brought together more than 25 news organizations, everyone from BuzzFeed to Political to The Nation, to sign a letter to the Department of Justice saying, hey, you have to pay attention to this. Because already in South Carolina, a legislator has pre-filed a motion to consider this bill. So this is not going to stop here. It is going to spread to other rights. It is going to spread to other pillars of democracy, and we all need to be paying attention and supporting the narrative change that we are trying to drive in this space.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This conversation can continue in the hallway later on today, but Roshni's coming. Look, there she is. She's waiting for me.
Gotta get up.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.